Thanks everyone for coming. We're going to get started. But first, I'm going to lay down a couple of ground rules here. This is not a convention debrief. That's not what we want to talk about here today, other than to say congratulations to those who won. We'll leave it at that. We want to talk about coalition building and how to reach out to communities. So the purpose, actually, of this meeting, and I'll tell you the reason we set the time as we did, 7 o'clock after the elections and so on, is because we knew that only the core activists around the convention would come out at this time. And looking around the room, I see a lot of familiar faces, and I think we succeeded in that goal. So we have a fantastic panel, and everybody on it has real solid experience doing this kind of grassroots organizing across the country. So the purpose here is to get a discussion going and see what we can build and what we need to actually put together the movement that we're going to have to build to face the challenges that are in front of us. So we haven't talked about any particular order, so maybe I'll just go with the order of names on the list. And when I did that, it was roughly east to west, I thought. So we're lucky enough to have the president of the Halifax and Dartmouth District Labour Council. She has some real solid experience doing this kind of work with a group called Solidarity Halifax, which has done some amazing things lately. And turn it over to Sister MacNeil.
I'm super excited that I can just speak at the table here and not be on a podium. So thanks, Mike, for arranging these wonderful tabletop microphones. And so I do have a lot of different hats and roles in my activist life, as many of us do in our communities. And I am here sort of firmly with my Labour Council hat on, because I think a lot of us. How many folks here were at the CLC convention, or are at? Okay, so a solid most of us. How about other folks who aren't, but just came to see this? All right, cool. Well, welcome and thanks for coming. So, for those of us that have attended this convention, one of the big questions that I know myself I always ask whenever I go away from a big event like this is, how do I take some of the amazing energy from the discussions that we have and the amazing resolutions that we debated on and discuss and adopt, some of the commitments that we make as a movement, how to sort of take all of those and bring that energy back to sort of the grassroots level in our communities and the rank and file work in our workplace, where we're kind of doing our stuff day to day. And this is not really always an easy question for us. I think as we've gone through a couple of decades of neoliberalism and a real decline in workers' power. Many of us have also come from communities where a generation ago there existed an activist infrastructure that simply for many of us doesn't necessarily exist in the same way anymore. And so when we're thinking about coalitions and who to connect with, we're not necessarily able to connect to something that is already there and is already pre-organized. And so, as much as we're talking about coalitions, which for me is about a relationship between different organizations, we're also, and I think probably Mike would agree with me, talking about specific organizing that we need to do. And so I hope some of you have some brilliant answers to that. But for me, and I would like to stress that I'm not necessarily speaking on behalf of the organizations that I belong to at this moment, whether it's the Labour Council or whether it's Solidarity Halifax in that capacity. And I hope that the questions that I raise, though, give us whatever our capacity, like give us a few things to think about and take back to our communities. So to move along with that, I want to talk about back in 2011, when the postal workers were locked out. There was a huge question for a lot of us on the left about how should we pursue solidarity actions. I was not living in Halifax at the time, but a number of my friends and comrades who were started doing some pretty interesting things. At the time, we had a number of folks in Halifax that were labor activists, folks from the student movement, anti-poverty activists, like a whole array of what I like to term the usual suspects, who were used to working together on various things in an ad hoc fashion as issues pop up. And at that time, we were just in the process of holding a series of conferences to talk about ways to kind of regroup on the left and ways to kind of formalize some of the working relationships that people had come to know and rely on. And so in the middle of this process, the postal workers lockout happened, and so a number of this formation of folks came together and said, okay, like let's do a We Support Postal Workers campaign. And so they developed a number of materials, threw them up on a little WordPress website. They did some door-to-door canvassing. They organized a really cool picket line dance party, and a whole number of cool things like that. And it was through that kind of common action taken together that a lot of trust developed, a lot of skills were developed, and it really kind of formed a basis for a cadre that would later be one of the things that later formed this organization, Solidarity Halifax. And so one of the things that I want to stress, of course, is as we're thinking about how to kind of make the anti-austerity and left and however we define ourselves, how to make us sort of gel a little bit together. Think about that it's through action that we sort of learn to bond together and build trust. Sometimes I think over the years we've tended to take a little bit of a top-down approach. Sometimes it's almost like anyone watched the American version of The Office. It's sort of like when it was very obvious to everybody that the character Michael Scott had to declare bankruptcy. His finances were like in a real shambles, and so they finally, okay, like now's the time to declare bankruptcy. And so he just went to the middle of the office and just said, "I declare bankruptcy." And he felt really amazing afterwards, real sense of relief and purpose. But his colleagues were like, "Oh my God, you can't just say that you're going to do it." and so we should keep this in mind, that there is a real danger sometimes of us sort of planting a flag and making a declaration, but not really coming up with a plan of follow through. But I think that we're at a point now where it has become increasingly clear that something, oftentimes does need to give, and there is a real impetus for figuring it out at this time. I think, especially as we've seen a lot of instances of coming together in various ways that make sense. We have seen groups like Solidarity Ottawa and Solidarity Winnipeg come together. The group We Are Oshawa is really cool. There is also a broad left network of various groups that came together in Halifax on Solidarity Halifax's initiative, that are forming a basis of a network that could lead to some really cool things. And I think that with the recent formations, like the really important work around Black Lives Matter and a lot of the upsurge in Indigenous resistance against resource extraction projects like the Alton gas resistance in Nova Scotia. Now is definitely the time for us to be addressing these questions, and I really thank Mike for taking the initiative to set up this event so that we can have these discussions. And I have a lot more that I can say, of course, but I'll leave it at that right now so that we can have plenty of time for discussion.
We have Bilan Arte, who's the outgoing chairperson of the CFS, and she's speaking on behalf of the LEAP Manifesto tonight because she's working with them now.
First of all, I just want to say that was really incredible, so thanks for sharing some of those thoughts. Hi folks, good evening. My name is Bilan Arte. I'm currently the New Communications lead with the LEAP Manifesto, but I'm also just finishing up a term as the chairperson, the national chairperson of the Canadian Federation of Students, which is where I think most people here have heard me talking about free education quite a bit. Lots of nodding heads. I first of all wanted to just thank the organizers here at the Canadian Union of Postal Workers for inviting me. And I wanted to provide some background on some of the work that I've done around coalition building that can hopefully add to some of the discussion that we're having here this evening. So in my work in the student movement, and I first got involved in the prairies at the University of Manitoba, our campus solidarity groups between student organizations, student unions, and on-campus unions were so incredibly important. They were so vital when we had to fight austerity budgets coming directly from our administration that attacked the rights of workers on our campuses, whether those were food workers, custodial staff, or even the people who were teaching us, professors, TAs, etc. And so from the very beginning of my involvement in activism, this notion of coalition building as a tactic and this ongoing strategy towards the success of the campaign was very deeply embedded into the way that we built our own campaigns. And many of you are familiar with the campaign cycle, I'm assuming, agitate, agitate, organize. One of the things that I have learned in my 5 years of student organizing is that if we're organizing around a particular issue, particularly something like post-secondary education or access to public education and high-quality education, then we're actually talking about something that affects a variety of different spheres in our public lives that not only affected students and young people, but also their communities, their families, and the necessity, the importance of having these conversations not only on campus about why free education was important, but also at community fairs, at community centers, at malls, in different spaces. And for me, being able to reach out directly to different organizations, specifically in labor, to help support our efforts at the University of Manitoba, meant that we were able, as a province, to consistently stay one of the provinces with the third lowest tuition fees in the country. Now that reality is changing, and if anyone here is from Manitoba, then you know that there's a really big challenge in that province now with its conservative government. And so in the national office, we continue to support the work of students in Manitoba. And students in Nova Scotia, students in fact across the country have been working very closely with Labour, and those coalitions are integral to the success of our campaigns. Now, another example that I wanted to draw is a national campaign that we built around free education, which many of the unions that are in this room that are present here today actually signed on to. That was such an incredible campaign, and it was actually historic in the sense that it was the first time that our federation on a national scale in over 10 years had actually talked about demanding just free outright post-secondary education for all, period. We had talked about for a very long time incremental change. We had talked about for a very long time negotiating a section of post-secondary education system that could perhaps be more subsidized than others. And for the very first time last fall, we talked about just outright demanding free education. Now, students and young people organized on over 58 campuses in 36 cities across this country. But what was truly remarkable about this campaign is that we got the signatures of over 90 different coalition partners, 70 of whom were labor organizations across this country that came out and showed up for students. And that was incredible. That was massive. And it really sent a shockwave towards communities across this country that free education is not just something that young people were advocating for, that students were advocating for, that it was in fact a community demand, and it was in the best interest of our society to have, for everyone, no matter what their background was, no matter how rich or how poor rather their families were, that everyone should have access to post-secondary. In budget 2017, there was the introduction of $90 million of federal funding for the post-secondary student support program, which is the only federal program today that exists to support Indigenous students' access to post-secondary education. That was a direct victory of our National Day of Action. We couldn't have achieved any of that without you folks. So I just want to take a moment to say thank you. I've been doing that this whole week, but without the support of Labour in our campaign efforts as a student movement, we never would have gotten as far as we did. And all of you in this room and the unions you represent are there for me to thank. I also wanted to talk a little bit more about what I've gained from that experience and what I've learned, and why I'm really excited about the work that's happening right now with the LEAP Manifesto. So the LEAP is a document that the Canadian Federation of Students has signed on to last year that many of you are perhaps aware of, but just to explain, the Manifesto is a series of principles that was adopted in September of 2015, right in the middle of a federal election that many of you might remember was quite all over the place. There's a lot of discussion about thinking about the future, thinking about a particular use. We had a government eventually who was elected from a party that spoke nonstop about youth and the future and addressing the issues around climate change. But what the manifesto pointed out is that society was ready for bold action, that our Canadian communities were willing to come together, and in fact, hundreds of initial signatories were willing to come together and talk about the importance of building a bold new vision for the kind of Canada that we wanted to live in and the kind of world that we wanted to support, a world that was based on a principle and a premise of caring for one another and for our planet. And it's been said many times at this convention already, but the importance of green jobs and a green economy when we're thinking about how we transition away from a carbon-based economy where we are today is so critical, because we know that there are no good jobs on a dead planet. And so the LEAP Manifesto is building up coalitions today with over 10,000 different signatories. Many of these are organizations like unions who are represented in this room, and they're so important and critical to have working together to help build this document beyond just being a series of principles, but being something that we can actually put into action. When I've been explaining my transition from a student movement to a broader organizing movement around climate justice, I've been talking about it as a transition that really cares about the future of my generation and the ones that are coming after me. When we talked about the issue of access to education in the student movement, we talk about it in a holistic manner, and we talk about the importance of young people not only being able to access skills and training, but also having access to a good future, and that including having access to good jobs and to good unionized jobs. Today I'm doing that work and pushing that a little bit forward by also talking about the importance of those jobs being green jobs, because we know that those are the ones that are actually going to secure a good future and a livable future for the generations that are to come. And so those are some of my experiences around coalition building. I think that work is critical. The last thing that I would add, though, is that I think it is even more critical that that work is actually led through the empowerment and the work that we know has been happening for decades and generations already by racialized Indigenous communities. I think it is so important that our work is grounded in understanding of challenging colonialism. I think that we have a huge responsibility to do that right now as the Government of Canada celebrates 150 years of colonial violence and genocide and refuses to acknowledge that. And so I think that our communities that are represented here today, the organizations here, have the power to build capacity and have the power to support campaigns that are grassroots, that are Indigenous and racialized communities run, that may not have the resources to be able to effectively deliver their message to the masses, but with the support of each and every one of you in this room, and that's really what the LEAP is trying to achieve, we can amplify that message and make it so loud that our government can't help but hear us. Thank you.